Hi, good afternoon. It's Mark Gracie here from Flowify Digital and the Digital Compliance Hub. Thank you for joining this webinar. We're going to be looking at the role of cyber insurance and how it can help you in protecting your business. We are going to be joined by Tristan Webb a bit later into the presentation, and he's going to talk about the insurancey bit. But just to let you know that I'm recording this session, so we'll distribute a link to the video afterwards, and then you can revisit anything that we've said at a later date if you wish to. We'll take questions at the end, so if you've got any questions, you should have access to a questions panel within the GoToWebinar control panel, and if you type your questions in there, then we'll pick them up at the end. We're probably going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. So if you, as I say, use the questions panel to ask us any questions. So first up, let me just do some introductions. So I'm the chap on the left, Mark Gracie. I run a consultancy called Flowify Digital, and I run an online service called Digital Compliance Hub, which I'll talk about in a second, in a moment. And I provide various services related, mainly, not surprisingly, about GDPR right now, but also marketing compliance and things like that. And my background very much is in a regulatory field, having worked in the internet industry since the mid-90s, and dealing with everything from data protection compliance to dealing with regulators and influencing external stakeholders like the government. So I've got a bit of a background in technology and also the legal sides of it as well, and sort of cybersecurity fits into that quite nicely. As I say, we're going to be joined by Tristan from Aspire Insurance. He's going to talk about the insurance aspects of things, and I'll let him introduce himself when he starts off that part of the presentation. Just briefly, I talked about the hub, and this is an online service which you can try for 14 days for free, and you get access to information, guidance, and toolkits, and also a helpline that covers a vast range of compliance-related things in an online environment. So data protection, as I say, is a key thing at the moment with the GDPR. We've got privacy and marketing compliance as well, and also web and data security. But the focus, if I'm honest, is mainly GDPR at the moment for obvious reasons. So by the end of this session, hopefully we will have covered off, so I'm going to do an introduction to some of the sort of security things to think about, and also some references to GDPR and what that means from a security point of view as well. But you should hopefully have an understanding about what it is that you need to think about, and also what you can do to comply. And the main thing we'll be focusing on there is the role of cyber insurance, both in terms of cybersecurity and data protection, and protecting your business from the kind of things that we hear about in the press nearly daily at the moment. And on that subject, actually, what is the issue here? Well, you have cybersecurity, so these are the cyber attacks, people sending you different types of communications to trick you into giving out money or giving you access to your systems and services, which we'll talk about in a second. And then following that, the data protection aspect of things, and what your obligations are from a GDPR point of view. And I've just listed a couple of things there, well, three in fact, of some really well-known things that are either happening right now or have happened most recently. I mean, the WannaCry thing happened earlier this year and was a ransomware infection, which led to lots of businesses being infected with some ransomware, and the NHS was most famously probably the one that got hauled over the coals by the media, because they were running out-of-date versions of software, which led to the vulnerability being exploited. You may have seen recently Uber have been covering up the fact that they had a massive data breach where a load of their customers' data was stolen, and they reckon 2.7 million UK customers had their data stolen due to the breach. And if you're thinking, well, actually, my systems are secure and things like that, then you also need to consider the Morrison's case and what that might mean. So Morrison's, the supermarket, they had a breach a few years ago where an employee basically published the payroll records of a couple of hundred, I think it was, members of staff, and the staff took Morrison's to court. The guy who did the leak went to prison for 8 years, but the Morrison staff took Morrison's to court, suing them for the damages and harm for the fact that one of their employees had leaked their payroll information and the implications of that on their well-being as well as their financial circumstances. And the staff won the case. They perhaps didn't get exactly what they were after, but the judge declared that Morrison's had a vicarious liability, i.e. they have a liability because it was one of their employees that had caused the breach, and therefore they will have to pay the damages. So even if you aren't the cause of the breach yourself, and it's a member of a rogue employee, and I think the issue here with the Morrison's case was the fact that the employee was carrying out a vendetta against Morrison's about something else, and it was that vendetta that led to the breach of the data. So even though it wasn't Morrison's fault the breach happened, they in a roundabout way had some kind of involvement in that, and that's where the case got to. This is only, I think, last week that the finding of the court, and Morrison's are set to appeal it, so there's still something to watch out for on that, but it just highlights some of the issues around risk to your business, even when it's not you directly having caused the problem. So when we talk about cybersecurity threats, we cover a whole host and range of different topics. We've got your phishing emails. So these are emails that look like they've come from people that you might use, so typically banks or Amazon or Apple, and they try to trick you into visiting a bogus website. So it's a website that looks like the official website, but is actually obviously very different. And the concept there is they'll try and ask you to re-enter your login details because they've been lost, and they need to get you to re-sign in and things like that. And of course you hand over your credentials, and then they have access to whatever credentials you handed over, which will either be the access to the bank account if it was a bank, or they would have access to your password, which they would then use to perhaps test other platforms to see whether they can identify other accounts they can take over. So if you have one email for lots of different systems and you get tricked into phishing, then you might find yourself in a bit of a sticky situation because you are giving away your password to all your different systems. So phishing is quite a common thing and has been going on for probably decades, actually. It used to be Nigerian princes telling you that they had lots of money they'd like to share with you to try and get it out of Nigeria, and those kind of fraudulent emails sort of have dwindled now, but they still exist, and along with all of these other ones to try and trick you into signing into your account with a household name. There's also SEO fraud. So this is particularly relevant to businesses where a business receives, or an employee within a business receives, an email that looks like it's come from somebody senior within the business telling them to make a payment somewhere. The fraudsters will do a lot of effort, take a lot of effort to actually work out the tone of voice of the managing director or the chief executive, and use their signatures in their emails and try and write an email to, say, a more junior member of staff and said, I know that I'm away from the office today, but I need you to sort this before the end of business today. And of course the junior staff might think, oh gosh, if he's asking me, I better do it. And if you don't check over that email properly, then you end up transferring funds to a fraudster rather than the actual person that you thought you were transferring the money to, and then you're also liable for actually obviously paying the person when they actually say, well, you didn't pay me like you thought you did, and my bank account details haven't changed. So there's certainly an issue for a lot of businesses there where they're being tricked into handing out money to the wrong people because members of staff have not realised the email wasn't from the employee they thought it was. You've got ransomware, which is a form of computer virus, which is a piece of software that gets installed on your computer, and ransomware typically encrypts that the content of your computer, or possibly even your network drive. So if you're connected to a computer network, then your all your data across your network could also be encrypted. And then you're typically told that you have to pay some cyber currency, typically Bitcoin, to pay to have it unlocked. And they're usually quite small amounts, so you know, it's not, you're going to be told £2 million worth of Bitcoin to get your data unlocked. It's more likely to be 200 or 1,000 or a couple of £1,000s, which on the face of it doesn't sound like very much, but of course you're highlighting your vulnerabilities, and there's no guarantee you'll get the data back, which means you need to consider whether paying's the right option. And there's lots of businesses out there who do pay, because it is very small amounts of money, and actually the people sending it out are actually collecting lots of small amounts of money rather than, you know, going for big hits. So you need to be careful about what kind of data, what kind of attachments and emails you open, what kind of software you run on a computer, and so on, because that might be the source of the ransomware. Your computers could be taken over again through some kind of virus infection or malware in a distributed denial of service attack. So what that is and some big name businesses have suffered these kind of attacks, and that's where lots of information through the internet is sent to a particular server or machine or a web page, with the view of bringing that down and making it run much slower. Sometimes to crash it so that it can then be restarted, and then the hackers can get in because they've probably gone back to default passwords and all these kind of things. And whilst you might not suffer the attack yourself, if you've had a machine that's taken over by some kind of malware that enables the functionality of control, hackers would use your machine to send some of those packets. And so you may have heard about the Internet of Things and some of the risks of not changing the default password. We're adding all of these appliances. There's even you know, toys you can buy for Christmas that are internet enabled. Well, all these internet enabled devices, if they're hackable, so somebody can get access to them, they can be used to send off packets to other servers, and that is what essentially ends up being a DDoS attack. So again, you might not be immediately the recipient of that attack, but you might be part of the source. So you've got to be mindful of those kind of things. And of course, then you've got your traditional hack attacks. So that's somebody guessing your password or brute force attacking your website or other credentials to try and get in and manipulate their way into your systems. And that may be as simple as not having a safe enough password, or not having patched your latest piece of software to patch up a vulnerability that's in the latest release. So a bit of a depressing start to a presentation, talking about all of the negative things that can happen online, and in reality, it doesn't really actually stop there, because whilst typically we talk about cybersecurity, we refer to you know, hacking and you know, and ransomware and things like that. But actually, there's pieces of legislation that put obligations on you as a business to make sure that you apply security to protect the rights and privacy of maybe your customers and the people who interact with you. And you know, a key part of security considerations has to be data protection. And in case you've missed it, we've got a new piece of European regulation coming called the General Data Protection Regulation. It goes live on the 25th of May 2018. You have to be prepared by then. But the GDPR is not much different than existing data protection rules. There is a principle of security, which is that all processing, so that's everything you do with the data, including storing, transferring, manipulating, collecting, and using for the purpose that you've collected the data for in the first place, has to be done in a secure way. So you have to think about, well, if I'm transferring this data from in an Excel spreadsheet via email, am I doing that in a secure manner? What might be these the security ramifications of that going horribly wrong, and so on. So you have a duty that if you're processing personal data as defined in data protection regulation, to make sure all of that processing is carried out in a secure way. And furthermore, the GDPR introduces for everybody a duty to report data breaches. So if you're if your systems get breached and data gets unlawfully accessed or unlawfully modified, you have a responsibility under the GDPR. If there's a chance of a harm to the data subjects, the people whose data it is that's being leaked, you have to report that to the regulator, which is the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. And you may have to tell the state data subjects as well if there's a high chance of risk to them from the leak. So credit card details being stolen, for example, is a good example of where you're likely to have to report that to the ICO and tell the data subjects so that they can cancel their cards and make sure that they don't suffer from further damages from their billing information being available. And if that wasn't enough, everybody's talking about the penalties that the GDPR introduces, and of course that's, if anything, is an indication of why you need to pay attention. We probably won't see the largest levels of penalty, which are 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever is the largest, but nonetheless there is ramifications that you could be found liable from a data protection point of view. You may be fined, and in some situations, and even in the Morrison's case, is an indication that data subjects have a right to claim for damages, and therefore they need to you need to consider the ramifications in it from a legal liability point of view of any kind of outcomes from a penalties point of view as well. So that was a quick ramble through some of the things that we need to think about in terms of protecting your business, and we'll get on to insurance in a moment. You clearly need to make sure you've got internal IT policies in place, so you have password controls, you protect your computers from virus, vulnerabilities. You make sure that your staff understand how to lock their computers when they're away from their desk and so on. You obviously have to maintain your security. One of the issues with the WannaCry ransomware infection was that it was attacking computers that could have been patched but weren't. And similarly, we hear all the time about website vulnerabilities, particularly if you're using something like WordPress, which is very popular, therefore it becomes a target. You need to make sure your website software as well is kept up to date, particularly if you're providing or you're storing access behind the scenes in your website to personal data. And you need, as I said, you need to think about the data processing and the security of that processing. Are you sending stuff via email? How do you make sure that this data is stored, securely? So even if you're in a paper-based environment and you store your paper records in a filing cabinet, is that filing cabinet locked? Is it in a room that gets locked overnight? Is it in a building that's got a fire alarm? Sorry, a burglar alarm, and so on. If it's personal data, is it stored in a fire safe to make sure that if there was a fire, that that data you would still have that data, because that's a requirement of data protection from a security point of view. So there's quite a lot to think about, and I do a lot of talks about GDPR, and I work with a lot of businesses about GDPR, and security is clearly at the top of the list of things for people to worry about. It's not the only aspects of GDPR things to think about, but it does go down to things like passwords and staff approaches to securing that data and how they transfer data, particularly via email, because they've re-emailed everything and not realizing that if they email it to the wrong person, that's a data breach, and so on. So there's quite a lot to think about when you come to security, just from a data protection point of view, but also the ramifications for your business should something happen and you have a cyber attack from that point of view. So it's important also to train you and educate your staff if they can understand the risks that you face, even if it's you explaining what a CEO fraud is and making sure that they're kept up to date with the latest threats, or that you're running an IT team that has got relevant technical know-how to make sure that all your systems are up to date and locked down. If you can educate your employees, that will go some way to protect your business. Something much more complex than that, and I've really oversimplified it, otherwise we'd spend the whole thing talking just about this, not actually getting on to Tristan, which is what we're going to talk about next, is really the role of cyber insurance and what kind of role that has in terms of protecting businesses and offering that, I guess, assurance around brand awareness and brand protection, as well as dealing with the things when it all goes horribly wrong. So I'm going to switch over now, technology allowing, to Tristan, who will run you through his presentation about his cyber insurance, and then we can take some questions at the end.
Yes, thanks, Mark. So as Mark says, my name is Tristan Webb, and I own and run Aspire Insurance. We're commercial insurance brokers and specialise in business insurance. And we have quite many existing clients that have cyber policies, and so we're at the sharp end really as to what the policy does and how it responds in the event of a breach. And I thought what I'd do is just give a brief overview really as to how it responds and whether it's something that people should consider or not. Starting initially, I thought we'd look at why now. As Mark says, you know, there's a lot. It's been around for a while, actually. We've had cyber and data insurance for over a decade, and it's been developing alongside the client's requirements to hold more and more data on electronic equipment. So this isn't just websites. This is emails. This is VoIP phones, point-of-sale systems, and so on. And so maybe in the earlier days it was the preserve of the big nationals, but however, we're seeing more and more SMEs being victims of cyber attacks. And of course, the traditional insurance policy doesn't respond. So there was the requirement for cyber insurance. Obviously, there's the crucial tipping point that we'd expect is the GDPR regs coming next year, which as Mark's already gone through in great detail, I won't go into now, but obviously that increases the amount of fines and the responsibility for business owners as well. And so you'll see there's an awful lot of noise on the internet as well with regards to cyber insurance. And so I thought it would be a good idea to kind of clarify really whether it was required or not. Insurance essentially is just a risk transfer mechanism. And so first and foremost, as Mark's alluded to earlier, the main thing is to get the housekeeping in order and establish if you have the risk. And in doing that, you know, how you would go about managing that risk yourself. And then we can look at where the insurance steps in. So before you really look down this route, you need to identify the risks that your business face and how you can manage those yourself. The government have launched the Cyber Essentials website, which does give you a really good overview of things like how to secure your internet connection, how to secure the devices that actually operate within your internal systems, and your protection from viruses and malware, that type of thing, and making sure that they're kept up to date. And same with controlling access to your data and services. Once you've obviously gone down that route, we can look at the data that you actually hold. Do you hold your customer or your employee details? And how those are backed up and how often. We've had instances where the backup has been infected, so they go to restore the backup, and of course that was infected. These things can go back quite a while, so simply having a backup isn't always necessarily ideal to resolve these. And your ability to trade. A lot of businesses that we deal with are reliant on websites, but an awful lot aren't, and they may be reliant on emails, that type of thing. Whether they have a process that's in place to actually, in the event of a hack, do they have a business continuity plan? So often, as Mark alluded to, your payroll can be on digital systems, or your supplier invoicing and customer invoicing can all be on digital systems as well. You need to address the financial impact as well. Certainly internally, we've changed a lot of our internal procedures to move the financial approval for invoice changes to verbal from financial controllers in the event that there's a main change in bank details. Because we've had instances of phishing emails going through to clients where invoices have had bank details changed, and financial controllers have just released payments without double checking, and payments made to hackers. And then, of course, you've got your reputational element of it. Do you risk manage yourself by checking for spoof websites using Google Alerts? And all very well if your website was hacked, saying, well, we could rely on our social media to communicate, but would you know what to do if your social medias were hacked? So we've got a huge, it's a long document, cyber risks health check, really just meant as a document that we can send through to anybody for free. But it's to help people challenge really the processes internally and whether they actually have got a procedure in place to deal with a breach when it occurs. So moving on to the product itself, it's important to understand before I go into this that cyber insurance, we've now got a huge array of insurance companies offering cyber insurance. and the cover varies quite radically from one to another. And so I'd give a caveat on the advice on this, that always check with your broker the extent of cover that you do have under your current policy. However, most commonly, initially, what should be covered would be the breach costs. These would be the costs in notifying the customers and regulators that the breach had occurred, and in some cases offering specialist credit monitoring services, and removing the virus and the malware from the system. Secondly, you'd expect cyber extortion ransomware. As again, Mark mentioned earlier on, if a hacker does steal the data, you need somebody that's going to help negotiate the release of that data. Otherwise, what can often happen is you'll get a partial release of data and you're a constant cash cow for them. And so the insurance company offers a specialist risk consultancy service that enables that. It will also cover the cost of the fines and the penalties with the business if they're assessed as non-compliant. It would cover the accidental loss of data. Again, this isn't an uncommon thing, employees accidentally deleting information from a business system. And not to be overlooked, the use of the specialist PR firm. You probably noticed in the national press those that have responded exceptionally well. And when you've got a professional to help guide you through what communication to release to who and at what timings, it really can help with the damage to the business. The business interruption quite often is an optional extension with a lot of insurers, but you can imagine simply having a payment to remove the malware is all well and good, but of course if the business has been down for a period of time because of that, you want the resulting loss of income to be insured. And again, as Mark alluded to with some previous cases, you'll have the privacy protection. So if customers or personal data has been breached, then that will cover the defend for the settlements against the business there. And one of my main issues, it says underneath here is we've got the additional or optional covers. And it's quite interesting. Most people's driving force is actually to have cyber insurance to cover cyber crime. And with insurers, quite often that's an optional extension. So simply going and purchasing cyber insurance doesn't necessarily cover you for phishing emails. So it is worth checking to ensure that the cyber crime, or sometimes referred to as the e-theft extension, that will cover things like phishing, or in larger cases, it's often called whaling. And that's theft of money by digital means. So often it's deception. It's the CEO attack that Mark alluded to, or the email that looks, for all intents and purposes, like a legitimate way of releasing information. We've also had instances of telephone hacking as well. The VoIP systems will have the telephone system hacked, and then outgoing calls are rerouted via a premium rate number, or it will automatically make calls to this premium rate number and run up costs. So there's really just a very, very brief overview of what can be covered under insurance policies. I'm happy to run through any questions at the end with anybody, but I hope that gives you a clearer explanation. And finally, there's my contact details should anybody want to get in touch, and we can run through extent of cover with people and help send you over the free assessment tool, which will give you an idea as to whether your business faces a risk or
not. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Tristan, for running us through that. Now's the chance for you to ask your questions, and as I said, there's a questions panel in your GoToWebinar control panel, enable you to ask those questions. While you're thinking about what questions to ask, I've actually got a couple for you, Tristan, that people ask me about actually quite often. The most common one is from a data protection point of view. So certainly when they're thinking about GDPR, is it possible to insure against the fine that you might get if you were to be fined?
Yes, yeah, both. Who we do quite a fair amount with, they cover the fines that are included in there.
And presumably the sort of a premium associated with that will depend on what kind of fine you're likely to have to pay out, or I mean, how does that work?
The premiums are often derived, well, different underwriters use different criteria, which makes it more complicated. But essentially, your turnover and the number of records that you hold or process because in fairness, the fines.
So you've cut out a bit at the end of there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the rating factor with the insurance companies is often the turnover and the number of records that are processed. And so that really, and of course the limit of indemnity that you select. So the insurance companies put it in various tiers, some starting at sort of £100,000 and going right the way up through to the millions.
Yeah, right, okay. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions, as I say, use the questions section in the control panel to ask those questions. Another question for you, Tristan. Are there restrictions on how quickly you have to report a notification to your insurance provider if you have suffered a data breach or some kind of security incident?
There are, but they're not as a specific time frame. I think many of them use as soon as you are aware or in good time or things along those lines, because actually what happens is that quite often people aren't aware of the data breach till quite a period of time past the data breach. So in the event of a phishing email where it's really quite straightforward that a breach has occurred and they've released the money and it's clearly not landed at the intended recipient, that's obvious and you can get straight to the insurers. But in the event of a cyber hack on a system, for example, those things can lay dormant, often in systems, for quite a few months, and the client will be unaware of those. And so the insurers don't put the specific time on there.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, actually, there's an interesting correlation there to the GDPR. So the GDPR says that you have to, if you have to notify the regulator and or the data subjects, then you have to do so within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. So if a business, so for example, if we look at the Uber situation, which is that they knew about the breach some time ago, they just sort of kept it under covers and, or allegedly kept it under covers and not actually told anybody. And it was obviously a significant breach with multiple millions of customers' data being breached. I mean, where would insurance sit with that if you didn't meet your regulatory requirement to report within the 72 hours, and it could be proven that you didn't do that?
I would argue that they may not have helped if they had cyber insurance. They may not necessarily have helped the insurer to respond, and the insurer may well have been within their rights not to assist. I mean, if as they say, if they did deliberately conceal it. Because in many cases, the insurers, they want to respond as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible to get the PR machine working to give advice. And I'm sure if they had advised the insurers, I can't imagine an insurance company would have advised them not to have communicated that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then we may as well leave it there.
I think one of the things worth noting with the cyber insurance is it's a bit like going to insure your house. And before you insure your house, you want to make sure you've got the right locks on the door, and you want to make sure that you've got the right alarm in place and that type of thing. And then the insurance policy steps in, and the more locks you have, the cheaper the insurance policy becomes. And that certainly seems to be the way with cyber insurance. More and more insurance companies are putting specific housekeeping restrictions in place to make sure that people have identified the risk and are doing what they can to encrypt devices and restrict the exposure in that way.
Okay, so do you think they're going down the route of, everybody will have to be Cyber Essentials accredited to be able to get insurance?
Whether that's the route that they go, so certainly Hiscox, they insist that all devices are encrypted, and different insurers have got different levels of that minimum security level. And in the commercial insurance market, that became an accepted minimum standard. And I think we're seeing more and more as the cyber insurance policy evolves, more insurers are going to subscribe to a minimum level of security. And it makes sense that the Cyber Essentials is a start point, although a lot of them don't allude to it at the moment, but that does make a sensible start point.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, there's no more questions come through, so thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Tristan, for telling us all about cyber insurance. And as I said at the beginning, I've been recording this session, so you'll be able to see the slides I ran through and also the ones that Tristan ran through as part of that recording, so I'll share them afterwards. And thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.